Deb, when I met you, which was not that long ago, really, right? It was at the stakeholders meeting that
Yes.
happened in Los Angeles for donor conception, which was so great to be able to be at and to meet you at. And then at ASRM, I was so taken with how you developed the company, and I had wanted to find out about embryo donation because so many people who I'm working with are starting to become interested in having children and building their family this way. So I was wondering, maybe we could just start off where you can maybe just introduce yourself a little bit and just tell a little bit about how you got into embryo donation and then what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having this Instagram Live. It's really one of those things that's there's so much there's so many people interested and there's not a lot of information out there. So
No.
I'm really grateful to be able to share it. So a little bit about my background is that I wanted to start my own family and was struggling to do it. And I had tried a lot of different ways and was frankly running out of resources to get it done. And I really, really wanted to have children, and I knew that the only way I could do it was good embryos. So I did it myself, and it was a real challenge. And I realized that there was a very big opportunity for donors people who have embryos in storage that want to give them to somebody else, and those who need to start their family or complete their family with embryos from somebody, and then all of these clinics who were not able to do the process because the process is actually pretty complicated. It's not one that is simply signing a document. And I think that's really the biggest learning is how do we get through that process in an effective and efficient way so that everybody feels good in the end.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really amazing when you start to think about embryo donation. At least to me, it's amazing because it allows people to build a family and it allows people who already built their family who have embryos to allow others to build a family. So there's a beauty, there's a synergy in it that's really interesting, and just relationships in it. But like, how does somebody find a donor or become a donor, or create an embryo and then decide to donate it?
Right.
How does
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually interesting. I just had a call today from a donor who said she tried to donate 5 years ago and couldn't do it, and then tried again 4 years ago and couldn't do it, and then finally found us because and that was somebody who actually found their recipient themselves but couldn't get through the process. So really to become a donor, it's really simple. You need to have gone through IVF and have remaining embryos that honestly, intended parents are looking for remaining embryos that they feel like have a good chance of success. So, we want to make sure that they're viable embryos, but most embryos that are stored are viable. So we want to make sure that they're viable embryos and that a donor is done with their family, right? That they've mentally decided, I no longer want to have children. That's really important in order to get from start to finish in the donation. You need to really feel confident that you're making this decision because you're done and you want to give this gift to somebody else. Those are really the only parameters. And then in terms of finding an intended parent, that
so
becomes a
important
lot
though
more
what you just
complicated.
said? I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think that's
Yes,
so important what you just said. Like, you want to be sure that somebody's mentally prepared to say, I'm done building my family and I'm ready
yes,
to do this. So that is central to most of this, is being able to
it really
accept
is.
access.
It really is. And when it happens, people know. And then they get their storage bill and they say, I'm done with my family and I don't know what to do with these embryos. I don't feel good about destroying them
Yeah.
because they're genetically related to my fantastic children. And how can I possibly destroy these embryos who are as great as my children? And yet they don't want more kids. They really don't want more kids. That's
Those
super important.
storage bills, from my perspective, really are triggering in so many ways because they
Yes,
remind you that you have these embryos in storage, and so what do you do next? So,
right.
so those are the criteria in terms of the embryo, and then who can be a recipient? Like, how do you decide who's appropriate?
That's a great question. So I guess I first want to take a step back and say embryo donation is not adoption, right? So we don't follow the traditional adoption protocols for embryo donation. And that means really anybody can be an intended parent as long as they are desiring to be parents. That's really the fundamental consideration, is that they want to be parents. Embryo Connections has some requirements that we filter down a little bit, and that's just for the sake of being able to donate these embryos so that somebody can actually use them, as well as satisfying donor concerns. So, for example, most clinics have limitations on how old you can be to transfer embryos. And so we apply that same thought process, which is to say you need to be 52 years or younger, or the combined age of 104. And that's really more for parenting. It's about, it's clinics establishing their own guidelines for how old is appropriate. And so because we know that we need a clinic approval, we want to make sure that we can get that. We also do a criminal background check because donors would like to see that we do it, but we don't do a home study because it's not adoption. And then the last is that you're either able to carry a pregnancy, which simply means that you've been evaluated by a reproductive endocrinologist that you can carry a pregnancy, or you're planning on using a gestational carrier. Either one of those options are available. The idea is if you get embryos, that you can use them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you make it sound very simple, but it doesn't seem like it's simple when you're going through it.
No, absolutely not. So I think, the first we were just talking about, like, how do you find your intended parent or your donor? I think this is one of the really tricky things about it, because you're matchmaking. You're really finding somebody that you are going to be connected with for the rest of your lives in one way or another, whether or not you have a tight relationship, a high engagement relationship or not. Those offspring are going to be genetic siblings. And so I think there's a lot of emotion on both sides. And I think that's what's so important to remember. And I think intended parents really are eager for donors to say yes. And donors are actually eager for intended parents to say yes as well, right? It comes on both sides, but you really want to find the right match for you.
I
So
thought
I
that was
think,
interesting
yeah.
when I was talking to you about how you do this and about your company and how there's different groups of people who are donating. There's some who want to have regular contact and kind of build out this family unit, and have relationships, down to the person who, and there's all different degrees, but it would go to the person who said, I'll be known, they can contact me, they can contact us, but we don't need to be in each other's everyday life. So it's really matching what works for each family.
It's true. It's true. And one of the things to consider is what kind of relationship you want for yourself as well as for your offspring, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we always have to be thinking to the point where it's actually, I think, sometimes challenging for intended parents to think, what is my 8-year-old or my 16-year-old going to want? Because what you're really thinking is, I want to have a baby. And it's hard to imagine that baby being 16 and having curiosities. So when we're matching, we're definitely trying to educate both donors and intended parents. But I would say both of them, both sides, I think, are coming in with the understanding that we want some level of contact, whether it's at 18 years old or right from birth, but something that will allow the offspring to be able to know about where they come from and or to know their medical history. And then there are some donors and intended parents, to your point, who say, let's have insular families. Let's kind of live our separate lives, and we're going to leave it up to the offspring to decide when they want to know one another.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got those who say, these are, like, I call it akin to cousins, right? Your parents don't let you decide whether or not you know your cousins.
Right.
Your parents introduce you to your cousins, right? You just know your cousins. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think there are donors and intended parents who like that idea of extended family, to say you should know your genetic siblings and forge that type of relationship. But it definitely spans from donor ID disclosure at 18 to that cousin-like relationship.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think of people who have been conceived through donor conception, and now these groups of people who are getting together to introduce the half siblings, because that's what they are. You see that some of them like each other, some of them don't when they're children, but they
Right.
meet. If the parents are in agreement, they meet and they all get together. I see that primarily with single parents. That group with donor conceived children, that
Yeah.
the single parents tend to gravitate. So
Yeah, I would say that and those who have one child. That the parents with one child say, I really want my child to have a connection, a genetic connection in the world.
very nice. That's really wonderful. Yeah. And, but it's a lot. It's a lot to go through. It's a lot to figure out how you're going to tell your parents, society, your friends, and everybody else. So it's
Yeah.
really understanding that you're ready for this type of a family building journey. So if we go back to the basics, right, about how
Sure.
this all gets done.
Yes.
So you started to talk about the difference between donation and adoption. And there's some serious implications also about the two. And I don't know if
Right.
you want to talk about that or not, but I think sometimes it's worth mentioning just with everything going on in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously there's a lot happening with embryo, what is an embryo? And I think the way the way both the federal law, the state law, pretty much all of the laws and the regulatory bodies consider embryos that are not in utero to be human tissue. And obviously, I'm not entering a political or social debate about this. It's merely what it is considered, and right now it's considered human tissue. There is obviously a big family component to it, but when it comes to donating your embryos, you're donating human tissue. So there's a human tissue donor, like you get to qualify as a human tissue donor when you're a donor,
Mhm.
and when you receive them, according to the legal space, it's considered quasi property law with a family component. So all of these legal agreements are going to talk about donors relinquishing all parental rights and responsibilities of any children born of those embryos, and the intended parent is picking those up. And what that's saying is that this is different from traditional adoption. Whereas traditional adoption says that there is a birth mother, and that birth mother has rights to maybe have visitation for that child. That's not true in embryo donation. In embryo donation, it's really up to the adults to decide and to the offspring to decide whether or not and how much they choose to interact.
Right. Yeah, it's important. It's important to understand that distinction. So with that question, I would say, do people have to get lawyers? Like, how does it work when they go through your organization or through any type of
Right?
embryo donation? Do you need to get a lawyer to draw up papers? And what would those
Right?
papers?
Yes. Attorneys will tell you, of course, you need a lawyer. And in this case, it's really true.
Turning on, take a quick look.
Yes.
So they chime in. We'd love to hear your questions if you have any. So that's fine too. Okay.
Um, so, did you have a question, or should I just keep
No, no,
going?
keep going. Keep going.
Okay, so yes, the process is really that we're going to, with Embryo Connections, we're going to create that. We're going to do that matchmaking. We're going to create the match for families that are aligned in terms of what their criteria are, so that we're matching with families who want to match with one another. And in that case, it also means that you get as many embryos as you need to complete your family, so that genetic siblings can stay together, which is really nice. And we're going to be matching on interaction preference. So you desire the same level of engagement as somebody else. Um, and then we're going to go through a thorough process to make sure that we have all the accurate medical records, and that the receiving clinic approves those embryos. Because what's really important is not just that they're embryos, but that a clinic believes that those embryos can result in a live birth. So part of our process is actually to evaluate those embryos before it even goes to a clinic, so we can ensure that the clinic will feel really confident about them. So we put together what we call an embryo suitability and eligibility packet, and that contains the medical records, the embryology history, thaw protocol, and also FDA screening, so that those donors have qualified as human tissue donors. And we send that to the physician, embryologist, and donor coordinator, so that that provider can feel really confident about accepting those embryos. And that's a really important step, that you not only have embryos, but that you have a place to transfer them, that there's somebody who says, yep, I feel good about this transfer. Um,
And is there usually
yep.
somebody who walks you through it? Because I'm thinking it's got to be so I know just from the people I work with, it's overwhelming. It's a lot of information, and it's a very different way, because people don't really know about embryo donation that much. It's a very different way to consider building a family. So if somebody was to call your company, what would happen? Would they get a case manager? Would
Yeah.
they get somebody assigned to them, or how does it help walk them through? Because it gets confusing.
Right. It's a great question. So, at Embryo Connections, we believe that everybody needs to learn and get their questions answered. So, we're going to schedule a meeting initially with a client care manager right away so that we can walk through the process and explain all the things we're talking about here, as well as the specifics for their donation, learn about what their interests are, and talk about what that means in terms of matching and in terms of your long-term success rate and interaction, all of that. So we're going to start with a client care manager and provide materials so that you're educated. About 15% of clinics have their own embryo donation program. And the reason it's so small is that it's actually a lot of work. We keep talking about this process, but it's a pretty extensive process. So what we do is facilitate that so that the clinic doesn't have to do all of that work. So we're going to get that intended parent started. They'll complete a profile. We'll learn as much as we can about them so that we can find the right match for them. We're then going to match, and that process can take a while. I wish it didn't take as long as it did, but it definitely takes several months for us to match with an intended parent, with a donor. But in the donors, it actually takes a lot less time because we have more intended parents than we have donors, but we generally try to do it within months, not years. So we're going to match intended parents and donors. They're then going to get to know one another. If it's open, they'll get to meet via a Zoom meeting so that they can actually get to know one another and discuss their interaction preferences and feel really comfortable. If it's semi-open or donor ID disclosure, we don't set up that meeting because it's intended to be a little bit more private. And then when both families give their thumbs up, we're going to seek that clinic approval that we were talking about. And then we're going to do counseling. And I think, Lori, you can speak probably more intelligently than I can about the real value of that counseling session. It's psychoeducational. It's not for screening, but it's really important.
Well, that initial session it's not a therapy session at all. It's really an educational consult so that you go into any type of donation process in building your family with what's called informed consent. And informed consent means that you understand the ramifications of building your child with with um, with some type of gamete that's not yours, some different DNA. And I find them so helpful for so many people because it gives you a space to talk through the process. So you'll talk about, the type of donor you want, what you're looking for, the type of relationship you want, your support system, how to tell your child, how to tell your parents or your friends or your neighbors if you want to tell, privacy versus secrecy. You'll talk about medical history and medical information, and the list goes on and on, down to prenatal visits and all kinds of things. So those are really for informed consent. They're not to screen people out at all. They're not psychological screenings. Now, and for embryo donation, the donor is not required to do any type of testing or anything, whereas in traditional donor situations they are, because they've already been screened. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is when you're going through some kind of a family building journey in this manner to get support, because it's something that is relatively new and something that you hang up the phone with your care coordinator, and as soon as you hang up the phone you have another question, and I think that's normal because
Yeah.
you can't take it all in. It You're able to break it down so simply or make it sound so simple, but it's not. It's complicated, and once you have all of this information to provide to somebody, and there's all these emotions associated with it, it's hard to capture everything at once. So it's great
Right.
that
I
you.
think yeah, it's a great question. And I think a lot of times there are maybe unresolved fears, which you could probably speak to, but there are a lot of unresolved fears because they have nobody else who's gone through this process as a donor or an intended parent that they're aware of. Some people might have done it, but they're not even aware. So
Right.
um,
Well, most people don't want
I
to share
think,
the.
yeah,
They just don't. They don't want to share the information. And when you go into the health system, although this is going to change with my initiative, I hope, soon, which other people are working, They will, it is changing actually. They are starting to integrate it. They will start to integrate it in the medical record within the next year or two. But it's something that people don't necessarily ask in the medical community. So they'll start to ask. They'll take the onus off of the patient or the parent so that they don't have to do that.
Right. Which I think is a really great idea. And I think it will make it more mainstreamed because
Mhm.
when you start seeing it on forums, it'll be easier to have that conversation and to start the dialogue about what it means to raise children that are somebody else's genetics, or know that there are children out there who are not in your family, but are your children's genetics.
Right. And it's really both sides. And I think support for both groups is really important, especially in the
Yeah.
beginning, first going through this process. So, I'm wondering, when people select a donor, lots of times they have criteria that they're looking for. And sometimes I hear people just are worried about intellect. They don't care what the person looks like. Other people are very concerned about medical history.
Right.
Um, People have the opportunity to tell you these different things about who they're looking for when they want to do an embryo donation. Or
Yeah,
how,
absolutely. Absolutely. And it really covers the gamut, right? I mean, some people will come in and say, I really need them to look like me, or I need them to have this characteristic that is like me. They need to be into computers and math, or they need to be creative. And then others might say, I need them to be geographically close because of interaction, or I want them far away because of interaction, right? So everybody comes in with their criteria. And I always come back and say, I mean, it's interesting because having gone through this process myself, right, I have my children, and I remember that I came down to, what are my deal breakers? What are the things that I absolutely can't live without? Because what I can tell you is that I could love a cat, right? And if I could love a feline, I can certainly love somebody who has different color hair, right? So it's one of those that you really want to think about what is super important to you. And obviously, to your point, I'm interested to, you were talking about privacy versus secrecy, right? Like, what are you planning on telling people, and what are you planning on telling your child? I think is important to be really processing as you're thinking about those criteria as well.
it is, because you really want to be able to feel comfortable with your story. And there's exercises that you could do to help feel comfortable. There's books you can read that can help you to become comfortable. But the most important thing is embracing your story. And I know that sounds very, theoretical, but it's really true.
That's very true. Start telling your story from when they're born, right? And then it's not, then it's yours, it's theirs. It's
I,
your real story.
yeah,
Yeah.
what I encourage people to do is tell the story before the child is born. So get
Yeah.
used to telling the story, and then the day the baby is born, you can start telling the baby just to continue to practice, so that by the time the baby is old enough to understand, they'll begin to be able to start to tell their story and understand it in their own ways. And
Right.
there's age appropriateness in terms of telling the child and explaining to the child, and the most that's key to know that your child is going to come home one day and say, "Mommy, how was I born?" And when they're asked that question when they're 3 years old, they have a very different curiosity than when they're 6 years old or 10 years old. So we have to be able, as parents, to become comfortable and be able to respond to the questions accordingly.
Yes, yes, I agree. And I think it's really interesting. I think we put our own filters on what feels okay, but for a child, any story that's about love is a beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
And so if their origin story has helpers, then so be it. That's a beautiful origin story. And I think it makes it much easier to move forward into life knowing that your child is fully informed about where they come from. And I would say the donor conceived community would absolutely support that. Um,
Yeah.
they're the ones who are saying, I don't want to learn later in life where I came from.
Well,
So, yeah,
it creates a whole nother set of issues when
yeah,
you later in life, because you're raised to believe one thing and then you find out something different, and so there's a lot to be said about that. So finding out
yeah,
and being told early and often and just having it part of a regular conversation is typically, and has been proven to be, the best way of educating your
yeah.
children about how they were conceived. And so I would encourage everybody and anybody going through this process start to write down their own story and, tell it to yourself. And it's really hard. It's not an easy exercise to do, not initially, but it becomes easier. I mean, you would know this better than me, Deb, right? As time goes on, and
Yeah,
that is becoming more comfortable with your
right.
decision to build your family and to have these beautiful children in your life.
Yes, it's true. And I talked to my 3-year-old about it, and her answer is, "I want to be a tree when I grow up." And you know that that there's a lot that they're processing, and it's just part of it's just part of who they are, and they'll grow up in their own way, learning about it. So I think it's great. I think what gets back to you had mentioned like criteria. I still think it's important to have criteria, right? You want to feel a connection with your child, whatever that looks like. And so I think it's valuable to have criteria, and you should.
Hmm.
Um,
And
yeah,
so, how does the criteria fit into the matching process? Because you're not looking through a book when you go to. I don't think you are when you go to
right,
use embryo as a form of building your family.
right.
Right? It's more
Yeah,
than being done.
yeah. It's a lot. It's interesting because with egg donors or sperm donors, you scroll through profiles and you find the exact perfect one that's the right height and has the right hair color and likes hiking or whatever it is. And then with embryo donation, it's interesting because you've got two partners already connected, right? It's already both sides, and so and it's only people who are donating their embryo, so your options are a little bit more limited.
Mhm.
But when you go into it, you want to say, here's what's important to me. And then at Embryo Connections, what we do is really a manual matching process. We call it assisted matching, and that we're going to find a connection with donors who are very engaged in donating. And I think that's important to know that there are definitely fantastic websites for people to connect, but they're a little bit like Match.com, right? Like you never know if there's like how
When you,
accurate it is.
when
And
you use the expression deal breakers, I know when I'm working with couples and they're going through marriage counseling, I always say, "What are the deal breakers?" So
yeah,
it's interesting that you use that expression, like, "What is the deal breaker?" And it's a good thing to keep in mind for a lot of people's
yes,
life.
yeah, right. I mean, deal breakers can be very simple. Like I had just like 2 deal breakers, right? And that was important to me. And when I made my decision, so you'll want to come up with these criteria so that in Embryo Connections, we have those and we can find the donor that satisfies those criteria and matches on all of those other elements, right? That they want the same level of interaction, like those things that are important.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it sounds like a voluminous amount of work to try and do that and to match the people,
Mhm.
but it's nice to know that there's somebody there that's taking things into consideration. And then ultimately, from what you said, there is a meeting, and then the final decision takes place between the person who is seeking to donate the embryo and the
Yeah,
person who is the recipient. So that people are part of that, and that's important. That's really important.
yeah,
Nobody wants process. Yeah, they don't want to
right,
feel that
right.
because some of
And
the
I'm just going to throw out there that people get really nervous about that meeting. People should not be nervous about that meeting. They're nerve-wracking for both sides, but the meeting is actually a wonderful connection of two families who really want to give and receive from one another. Like it's
are you on
really,
with that meeting? Are you
yeah.
part of that?
One of our client care team members are, so that we can facilitate it. But it's beautiful because donors are really excited to help somebody else. I mean, this is really about giving. That makes it very different from egg donation or sperm donation, where it's also about giving. There's definitely a giving component, and they're not choosing who their recipients are, and they're getting paid. So it's very different. I think this is really about a commitment to donate to somebody.
The way I see it, the major distinction to me is this is donating an embryo for a future child for your family that will be genetically siblings with my child.
Yes,
And so that is the huge distinction that I see, and that really speaks to how many full siblings there will be with this DNA. And I think that's
right, right. That's a big thing too. There can be a lot fewer siblings when it's embryo donation. Full siblings.
Right, right, full
Yeah,
sibling, because sometimes
yeah,
people who have the embryos worked very hard to get those embryos. And so they
yes,
really feel the struggle that other people have gone through for their family building journey, I think. And that could be part
yeah.
of the commitment, wanting to donate the embryo.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, that's when I was talking about commitment. That's really what I meant. Like, these are people who are saying, I went through so much and I really want to pass this gift along to someone else because I know how hard it is.
Mhm. So I don't know if you've heard this story or not. I'm sure you have, and I don't know if anybody who's on has heard the story or not. But it was in the news, I believe. I read it in the news or somewhere that there was a woman who had 10 embryos or thereabout 10 embryos, and each time they one of the embryos was given to somebody, and a child was born. They all came together, and then when the last one was found, and came together, everybody greeted that person and said, "We've been waiting for you," because they
That's
felt like
not me.
at that point. And I hope I have that story right, but that was the gist of the story. But I
Yeah.
thought it was an warm, loving story of how everybody engaged. And it's not to say that everybody will do that, because everybody has their own level of, boundaries really that they want to put up. And so when we were talking about before, concerns in terms of talking to people, it's not just talking to the child, but it's talking to your social network and your support system. And so when people come to you, uh, is that a concern that they express, or is that something that they're helped with?
Certainly, I think what's interesting is that we sometimes have fears from the donor side because maybe they used an egg donor, and back in at that time when they were using an egg donor, it wasn't accepted to communicate that you used an egg donor, and so they don't know how to tell their children, and so it actually becomes a conversation of how do I now open this conversation with my child who doesn't know that they were donor egg conceived or donor
Mhm.
sperm conceived? Um, I think on both sides, we're always talking about the best ways that you can communicate and what what a surprise it can be, a pleasant surprise when you do. Right. I think there's a lot of fear about what people might say, and I think by and large, people are really supportive and interested in the journey that you went through in order to be able to be a parent. I think they're more supportive than we give them credit for. Not everybody, of course, but we definitely have people come to us with those concerns, and we try to make it. We try to help by bringing people together where we can. Lori, as you know, we're starting a support group that will help people talk to other people who are dealing with the same questions.
Yeah, it sounded when you're talking about people who are saying, "How do I tell my child who was donor conceived that now I'm donating these embryos?" And it seems like the perfect way to have the conversation.
Yeah,
If their family help them, just like when I went to have you, I needed some help.
right,
It's just a perfect kind of beautiful flow of a conversation.
right.
It's,
Yes.
it's just
Yeah,
really,
actually, I'm going to bring that up next time because I don't think I've ever phrased it that way, but I think you're absolutely right. Um, I think they're going to find out. I mean, really, the thing is with 23andMe, everyone's going to find out where they come
Mhm.
from. So it's really good to make that a story about love and giving and happiness.
Yeah, and just how you're comfortable phrasing it. That's the
Yes.
most important. You as the parent, what makes you the most comfortable in facing it? So people come to you, and they start to think about embryo donation, and I'm so glad. Honestly, I can't thank you enough for coming on today, and I am so happy that these support groups will be offered, or these kind of community groups to come together to talk will be offered. It's important because it's still so new, and there's still so many questions. But what
Yes.
would you the main concerns are that you're getting these days?
I would say that, mostly if I'm thinking about an intended parent, they're really looking for obviously the best probability of success is their number one request, right? I want the best chance for success. I think we definitely have questions about being able to have access to information for that child. So we have a lot more intended parents coming in saying, I want to use genetic sources that we can reach out to at some point. Although most of our intended parents also fall on the side of they fear how much engagement a donor wants to have. I think that's the number one concern from an interaction standpoint. And so I think that's a really great topic to discuss, which is that donors, as we discussed, are done with their family. They really do not want more kids, and they're really clear about that. So they really are just excited to see these other fantastic children born, and they don't want to deny them access to where they come from or access to their genetic siblings, and vice versa. They want to make sure that their child or children has access to where they come from. And that's not all donors, but when we think about donors who want some version of open, it is never to co-parent.
Right.
There's no requirements for visitation. It's really they're thinking forward to the older children. They're thinking forward to the kids when they start being curious and they start wanting to know their roots, and they want to connect with their genetic siblings. Those are the years that they're thinking about. And so some desire that contact right away because they want to build a bond, but they're not going to intrude on your parenting style. And I think that's the number one concern that we hear from intended parents.
Well, I can understand that.
Yeah.
Perspective, that would be the number one concern.
Yeah.
Always.
But we also fear our parents are going to interact on our parenting style. That to me is a bigger concern than whether a donor will, because the donor actually has their own family. Like, they are busy with their lives and their family, and it's not the same.
So what do you do with your parents? How do you explain this to your parents that you're
Right.
doing this? Do you
Yeah.
find that you get?
So I think my best advice is really transparency. I think that's the easiest way to say it, because again, I think families are much more supportive than we give them credit for often. Not always, but often they are. And I would say the prospect of embryo donation is very hard to comprehend, right? For somebody who's not in it, the idea seems very strange. But when a child is born, that is automatically your, like in my case, right? Like my parents' grandchild. And you know, maybe I'm fortunate in that my parents were very skeptical because they didn't understand how I could possibly carry a pregnancy that was somebody else's embryo. But once it happened, I can tell you that those are their grandkids. There's nothing that's coming in between them and their grandkids, right? And they don't even think about genetics. Like, that's not important. And I think that's, you know, I think we see that a lot.
Well, because genetics don't make a parent. Genetics make,
Right.
you know, they do a structure. They do the DNA, but they don't make the parent. The parent just
Right.
raises the child, and that's what's proven over and over in the research and literature, and even just in seeing, you know, these families, that the person who is the mother or the father is the person who's there at night, and the person
Yeah.
who's band-aid on their knee, and the person who's talking to them or disciplining them or, you know, hugging them,
Right.
how to read and all these other things. But it's a natural concern, and it's a normal concern. And
Yeah.
I think that we have to allow ourselves to have that concern and say, okay, and work through it in order to be able to embrace the rest of this. So
Right.
just, like, you know, encourage everybody to who is considering this, and this, if this is a concern, talk to the case manager about it. You know, talk to
Yeah.
anybody who is qualified to talk to you about it, because you want to be as comfortable and secure with your decision as you can, even intellectually, that you know that this is going on. Emotionally, you may feel a little bit differently.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really good point. Another concern we hear is about recipient parents not feeling sure that their kids are always going to think of them as the parent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that's a big concern we hear, that maybe when that child is 13, they're suddenly going to want to find their real parents. and I think maybe you could speak to that as well. Like, I've read the research and I've seen reality, but I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Well, I think every teenager says something to their parents. And
That's right. That's what I say.
we're age of flux. We're talking about age of rebellion, and so most
Yes.
people say something, and so they very well might say that, and then 5 minutes later, they very well might come in and apologize, or they may say, "I need help." And as a parent, if you keep open communication about the topic and about how they were conceived, and you're there to always listen and to support, chances are that conversation won't be quite as heated because they know that you only want to help them with their curiosity and finding out what their family was, what their biological parent was like, or who they are, or how to find them. So that's where the open and often conversation comes into play.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I think it's your point. I think every 13-year-old is going to say, I wish you weren't my parent,
Right.
to even their own genetic parents whom they look exactly like. It
Well,
just happens.
years ago, I interviewed Chase Johnson for my podcast when I first started my podcast, and he was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And he was born through surrogacy, traditional surrogacy. And he said that his mom was his mom, and when all of his friends were saying that their parents didn't love them, he knew just how much his mom loved him because he
Yeah,
knew how much she went through to have him.
right. And I think that's such a valuable story too, right? You go through so much. It says a lot about how much you're going to engage as a parent. And I think it's just, I think that's real. That those kids know they're loved. They know
Yeah.
they're loved.
So, I just going to circle back for a minute. We talked about the legal pieces involved, like that
Yeah.
if somebody comes to your agency, then you coordinate lawyers and anything that they need. But can you talk a little bit about the cost involved with this? Because
Yeah.
fertility treatment is always so expensive.
Right. We did. And I actually just want to take a step back because I think I was maybe a little flippant about the lawyers, but we really do want to have a legal agreement because it's important that both families are represented by attorneys
Mm-hmm.
so that there is a sound legal agreement that is going to enforce that your child is yours, right? And vice versa. There are some questions about whether or not you want to have a parentage statement. I think you can speak to your attorney about that. By and large, the embryo donation stands as that parentage agreement. But so there's an entire process that we just talked about, and then after we do the counseling, we get the clinic approval, and we do counseling and legal, and then we ship the embryos, and then those embryos are at your clinic for you to do your own transfers on your own schedule. So the costs that I'm about to talk about are the process from when you say, I'm interested in donating, I'm interested in receiving embryos, to embryos are at my clinic and I'm ready to have my transfer. So that's typically about $9,000 to $11,000. And I give a range because there are a lot of costs that are not ours. They're not the Embryo Connections expenses, and every donation is different. So we only want to charge for what's actually happening. Um, so for example, there are 2 attorneys and 2 counselors, and there's the FDA screening, which we don't have to do on everybody. We have to do on everybody who is a genetic contributor. And then shipping, which can vary based on where the embryos are stored. We do reimburse donors for up to a year of storage during the time that they're donating with us. So there's that cost as well. That's what adds up to that $9,000 to $11,000. And then your transfer fee is typically about $5,000 at your clinic. So that's your own clinic's charge. So when you put all of that together, we're talking about somewhere between $14,000 and $16,000 for your first transfer. And then your second transfer is just the $5,000 at your clinic when you either try again, hopefully you don't have to try again, or you want to have a second child or a third child, right? Those embryos are yours. So when you think about that relative to the cost of a donor egg cycle, which can be upwards of $50,000, or even your own cycle that you then have to PGT test the embryos to ensure that they're chromosomally normal, and you don't know you're taking a risk that you're even going to get embryos at the end of the cycle. That can be upwards of $30,000. So these are embryos that are already created. We know the quality, we know their success history, and we know about the donors, right? We know how old they were when they created them, and the things that are important in making a viable embryo. So there's both the cost and then the probability on the back end that you're actually going to have a successful pregnancy.
Right. So it's interesting. I thought the cost would be in different directions, actually, because such high costs all the time. Not that this is not nothing. It's all significant money. And by the time you get to this point, many times, it's been very, very expensive. But it makes sense the way you broke it out. And I appreciate the range in explaining it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a big question people have all the time. And there are some grants out there sometimes, I believe, that people can find through different organizations that can help with fertility journeys. So,
right. And certainly there's more fertility insurance out there.
yeah,
So for those who can get some version of fertility insurance, some of these elements are definitely covered.
yeah,
Particularly the transfer, but ideally some of the agency fees and attorney fees, to your point.
yeah, no, that's great. Well, Deb, thanks so much. This was so much information, at least a huge amount of information. And I'm going to put this up on my Instagram page, and hopefully I'll be able to send it to you to put on yours, and then we'll put it on YouTube so people can come and listen to it, because I think you've explained so much in it. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lori. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I'm really grateful that you had this Instagram Live.
Oh, please. I'm so grateful you came on. Well, have a good evening. Your children, you're in different
Thank you.
time. You can tell it's dark here now. Look forward to being in touch soon.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.